Waiting is an inevitable part of life. It doesn't matter if you're waiting for your coffee order, waiting for the pair of shoes you really want to come back in stock, waiting for test results, or waiting on help while making a big decision. Waiting is tough. When you're waiting, you might feel excited, but you might feel skeptical too, especially when what you've been promised gets delayed. You start to wonder when you've waited long enough. Eventually, you might even give up hope. Sometimes people of faith have to wait on God. While we wait on God, we need to remember that God has a plan. God is faithful, God is listening, and we should never give up hope because God's not given up on us.
Have you ever heard of the Stanford marshmallow experiment? It's an experiment from the 1970s that studied delayed gratification. Here's how it worked. A kid was given a marshmallow, and they were told that they could eat the marshmallow if they wanted to, but if they waited and didn't eat it until the person returned, they could have a second marshmallow. The kids in the experiment were tracked over the years to see what kind of decisions they made as they got older. The goal was to see if the kids who waited, who practiced delayed gratification, who waited for that second marshmallow, made better decisions and had a better life and were more successful, and if that kind of translated into lifelong good decision making. And the experiment had some mixed results, and its conclusions were pretty hotly debated, but it's well known enough that it's been remixed and parodied, and you may have seen it on like a TV show or on YouTube. So what do you think? Do you think that you would have been one of the kids who would have eaten the marshmallow or would have waited for the second marshmallow? Or maybe you're like me and marshmallows aren't really your thing. So what would have made this experiment really difficult for you? What would you have had a hard time waiting for a second one of? Now, I told you the conclusions of the experiment were kind of controversial, and let me tell you why. First, the designers of the original study, they thought they had everything figured out. They believed that if a kid waited for the second marshmallow, it's because they had great self-control and patience, and that child would grow to make better decisions as they got older, and that they should be, as a result, more successful. But later versions of this experiment showed something important. Many of the kids from the study who ate the first marshmallow, who didn't wait, it wasn't because they didn't have self-control, or they made poor decisions, or that they couldn't wait. It was actually because they didn't believe that the adult, the random adult who gave them a marshmallow, was actually going to come through and follow through in the promise of giving them a second marshmallow. See, it wasn't lack of self-control, it was lack of trust that led them to do this. I believe that people make promises all the time, and unfortunately, most of us have been on the receiving end of broken promises. Sometimes we're stuck in this kind of in-between zone when someone promises something and they haven't delivered yet, and we're kind of stuck between now and not yet. And while we wait, a lot can happen to us. We might get frustrated or begin to ask questions or wonder if the person who made the promise is really worth trusting. We may even be tempted to give up hope. And when we're waiting on God to fulfill a promise, we can have these same sort of anxieties. We might wonder, can God really be trusted? Does God really care? Can God really see me? If God really loves me, then why do I have to wait so long for it? And right now, if you feel like you're waiting on God, I want you to know that there's good news. You're not alone. Many of us who believe in God have had times in our life where we really were put in a waiting zone. We were waitlisted, and we're waiting on God to fulfill his promises. And the Bible is full of stories of people who had to wait on God, some of them for a really long time. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to explore stories from the Bible about people who had to wait on God. And if you didn't grow up in the church, these stories and characters, they may be brand new to you. You may never heard them before. But if you grew up in the church, you've probably heard these kind of stories since you were a kid. Now, this doesn't mean that you really know them. And I think that's a mistake that sometimes we make. We think that because we've heard a story before, especially when we were a kid, that we know the story. But we often get told simplified versions of these stories when we're kids. And as we grow older, we need to revisit them and to explore them a little more. The older you get, the easier it is to see that these stories are more interesting and complex and full of tension than we maybe realized when we were a child. Now, before we get into this series, it's important for us to kind of understand how the Bible treats character stories. There's a video by the Bible Project that's called How to Read the Bible, Characters in the Bible. And here's a few things that they say about reading about stories of characters from the Bible. It says that the authors of the Bible prefer to communicate a lot of material with minimal details. In other words, the details matter. The details often become images of the moral character of the stories, of the characters that we're reading about in these stories. And sometimes, for instance, like a character will have a name, and that name will actually indicate the role they're going to play in the story. The biblical authors often will leave out things that we care about, things like motivation and thoughts, and focus on like small little details about who they were, trying to help us unpack a lot about them. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that the characters we read about in the Bible are heroes, that we should idolize them and do all the things that they did. But that's actually not how these character stories work. In fact, in the video, they said that most biblical stories highlight the moments when characters fail and come to an end of themselves. This doesn't mean that God wants us to act like them. See, these biblical stories are told. They use these characters in a way where the characters are like mirrors, and they're supposed to show us a reflection of ourselves so that we can see our human nature in these stories, in the reflection of these characters from the Bible. So today, we're going to see how an important figure from the Bible, he's named Abram, how he waited on God, and then he gave up on waiting on God, and eventually learned something vital about who God was, about God's character. And we first pick up Abram's story in Genesis chapter 12. The Abram, who you probably have heard the name Abraham before, because he was later named Abraham, he's known as the father of Judaism and Christianity. And he's a guy that God worked with thousands of years ago in order to set up a huge plan and a promise and to put things in motion for Abraham and his family, for Abram and his family. And in Genesis chapter 12, God comes and makes a promise to him that if he leaves his country and goes to a place that God is going to take him, that God is going to bless him. And Abram was an ordinary guy, but this wasn't far from an ordinary promise. This was a big promise for Abram. It was also a big promise for the world. But there was a problem. God had told them that he was going to have descendants. And at this point in his life, he didn't have any descendants. He and his wife, Sarai, they were unable to have children. And they were both already getting pretty old. If you fast forward a couple chapters in Genesis, to Genesis chapter 15, Abram and Sarai obeyed God by packing up their entire lives and hitting the road. But they were still waiting on this promise of descendants, of a family. And that was probably hard for them to trust. And so in Genesis chapter 15, we see more of their story. Abram was stuck in a waiting spot where he wanted to receive what God had already promised him. And he didn't have a timeline or a plan. It's a promise that God had given him. But he was officially waitlisted. So Abram and Sarai, they were probably asking questions of God at this point. They were asking, like, why is it going to take so long? Did I really hear God correctly? Did God really promise the things I think he promised me? Is there something else that I need to do? Does God really need my help to make this happen? After 10 years of waiting for a promise from God, Abram and Sarai, they were still learning to trust. And they were still learning to listen to God. And I'm sure that for the two of them, they felt pretty discouraged and impatient. And in Genesis chapter 16, we see that they took things into their own hands. Sarai got impatient with God. And so she decides to give her servant Hagar to her husband. And the two of them would have a relationship and bear a child together because Sarai was tired of waiting on God's promise to give them a family. And so it ended up causing tension and conflict in their family and their relationship because they didn't wait on God's timing. Now, remember how we said that the Bible tells us about people who fail in big ways and that you shouldn't necessarily imitate the actions of the biblical characters. Well, this is one of those times. See, in this moment, the two of them, Abram and Sarai, they're disobedient. They lack trust and they mistreat Hagar. And yeah, they had this whole relationship that was broken and messed up where Abram ends up sleeping with an enslaved woman to have their baby. It's a mess. It's complicated. It's not how things are supposed to be. So these stories are probably more complicated than you were led to believe when you were told the kid-friendly version of them as a child. So Abram and Sarai probably thought they were doing the right thing in the moment because God had promised them a family and they're probably trying to figure out the right thing, but they completely had messed up. They probably had things going through their mind like, oh, I'm getting too old to have a baby, and it doesn't make sense that God's made me wait anymore. And Sarai probably thought she's just helping God out. But what ends up happening is this whole plan backfires for them. God had promised her tons of marshmallows, tons of children, a big family, lots of descendants, but she didn't trust God to come through with the promise. And as a result, it caused problems for them. Well, God gave them new names. Abraham and Sarah were what God changed their names to in Genesis chapter 17. And in Genesis chapter 17, even after they messed up, God recommitted to fulfilling his promise for them. And this is what God said to them in Genesis 17:19. God said, "No, Sarah, your wife, is going to bear you a son, and you will name him Isaac. I will confirm my covenant with him as a perpetual covenant for all his descendants after him." So after 25 years of waiting for God's plan to come to pass, Sarah gives birth to a son, Isaac. Their promised son was finally here. Now, God didn't only fulfill his promise he made to Abram and Sarai, God even showed them grace when they messed up and when they were disobedient, and he blessed the child that they had in that disobedience there. So God could have punished and abandoned Abram and Sarai, but instead, God forgave them. And it's kind of like if in that first marshmallow test, the kid had eaten the marshmallow and the person came in and gave them two anyway. And the Bible doesn't spell out all the full details of their story. It leaves room for us to ask questions and to wonder what's really going on. But it's important for us to realize that even when we make mistakes, God is still faithful and can keep his promises. I don't know what promises you're waiting on God to fulfill right now, or which promises you need to wait for in the future. But here's what I do know. God can be trusted. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 7 say this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all that you do, and he will show you which path you should take. Do not be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil." See, just like Abram and Sarai, Abraham and Sarah, who waited for all these years for God to give them a child, here's the message that you need to hear, that I need to hear. God has a plan, but we may have to wait for it.